r/AskReddit by Reddition. Like and subscribe. What are some dark events that happened in history that not many people know about? In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit. Thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans. Huh. To be specific, it was the corpse of Velma McCurdy, the "You'll Never Take Me Alive" guy. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butter box babies. The boxes were either buried on the property, or at sea, or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. The Halifax explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically, there were two types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never like using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killing stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The sad case of Otabenga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo, who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. Not only was he in a freak show, but he was also put in the zoo, sharing an enclosure with apes. In the 1920s, the Osage Indians, Oklahoma, USA, discovered one of the largest oil fields on Earth. They went from being poor to being the richest civilization on Earth overnight. Imagine Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk living on the same street. The Osage were building mansions, hiring servants, driving exotic cars, and the women were marrying white men as trophy husbands. It wasn't long before people started moving into town and exploiting them. Slowly, one by one, they began being murdered. By the end, hundreds had died. The men were hiring people to kill their wives. Lawyers were drawing contracts to transfer oil rights and tricking the Osage into signing them. It was so crazy that it led to the birth of the FBI. This was one of their original investigations and is still largely unsolved. Martin Scorsese is currently writing/directing a movie about it. It's going to be based on the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which is where I learned about it. Super interesting read. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun. When they went out at night, they would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. The Massacre of Kalavryta. It is a village in Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire, but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this, and if you go to Kalavryta today his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag. But everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great-grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. Kuk Kik, or the chicken poop prison in Thailand. Used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious Thai people, in the Chanthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There's a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poop prison. I learned about this prison from my parents, who learned about it from theirs. How it worked was there was a small 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken coop. The grated floor/ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in Kuk Kik was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, father of Henry VIII. She was married off at age 12 to Edmund, 25, who was desperate to get her pregnant as quickly as he could. It was not unusual for members of the aristocracy to marry young. It was slightly more unusual, because of the risk to both mother and child, for them to get pregnant before the age of 14. Edmund died of plague while Margaret was pregnant. She was widowed and alone and pregnant during war. The birth was a very difficult one and would scar her forever. For a time they believed that she and her unborn child would perish. Not only was she very young, but she was also slight of stature and undeveloped for her age. so it's a wonder she even survived childbirth. It was so difficult for her that she never became pregnant again over the rest of her years, despite remarrying 2 more times. It is widely believed that she was physically damaged during the childbirth and was unable to conceive again, but it's also possible she was too traumatized to ever put herself in that situation again. Either way, Margaret devoted herself to her son, calling him my dearest and only desired joy in this world. Use of the Judas cradle for torture. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped seat set up high where the victim would be seated on the pinnacle while tied. The pyramid point would penetrate the victim's anus or vagina, and the sheer weight and movement of the person would slowly help it penetrate more. The torturer would sometimes add weight to the victim's legs, rock them, or add oil to the pyramid to increase the pain and quicken death. The Cambodian genocide. You could have been killed just for wearing glasses, therefore being an intellectual. At least this was the Khmer Rouge logic. The prisoners were tortured so badly that they tried to commit suicide in every possible way, even by using some spoons. The executions used to be like this. The prisoners were put on a straight line, and to the second prisoner was given an object like a shovel or a hammer which he had to use to kill the prisoner in front of him. Then, the same object was given to the third prisoners, and the cycle would repeat until there was nobody alive except for the last prisoner on the line, who was then killed by the guards. Since many medics were killed or sent to work as farmers, the local regime used child medics to conduct experiments on the prisoners. They used teenagers with no knowledge of Western medicine to experiment on people without anesthesia. For example, they opened one person's chest just to see his heart beating. In my honest opinion, this is even worse than Unit 731. The January 1945 sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a German ship carrying fleeing Germans from the Eastern Front to the west through the Baltic Sea. It was sunk by the Soviet Navy shortly after setting sail. The total death toll is unknown, but estimated at over 9,000, since there were so many stowaways. It is the worst maritime disaster ever, several times more than the Titanic. It didn't get nearly the press, because they were the enemy, so who cares? And the Nazi media certainly didn't report it, because they are at the waning days of a war they're badly losing, so the last thing they need is more hits to their already sinking morale. The Children's Blizzard. It occurred in January 1888 on an unseasonably warm day. The weather was nice and many school kids were tricked into not wearing coats or jackets to school, some only in short sleeves. While the kids were in class, the weather outside changed dramatically from warm and sunny at noon to dark and heavy like a thunderstorm, with heavy winds and visibility at 3 steps by 3 p.m. Children left school to go home and do their chores. This was in Minnesota, and were expected to milk the cows and do whatever else was involved in the family farm. But they got lost in the darkness and snow and the wind, and many froze to death in their town, just yards from houses or other sources of refuge. 235 people, mostly children, died. Human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during World War II, committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by Unit 731, a military biological and chemical weapons research division of the Japanese Imperial Military. There's not enough room in a Reddit post to list half of it, but here's a taste. Dissections of living babies, pregnant women, etc. without anesthesia, also known as a vivisection, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so on. Freezing limbs off of victims. Horror movie sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen, such as running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between. Not to mention the fact that the victims were routinely raped and tortured for the sake of rape and torture, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. And we are talking about thousands upon thousands of victims, usually hapless Chinese civilians, political prisoners, POWs, and the homeless, over the course of years in huge facilities with thousands of staff committing these atrocities. The icing on the cake. General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their war crimes, so long as they share their findings with America and only America. Many of the former Unit 731 members even went on to have very successful and profitable futures in Japan after the war. You know Jameson whiskey? Well, a long time ago in like the 19th century, one of their family heirs fed a little girl to cannibals. Like legit went and bought a little girl in the Congo as a slave and brought her up to a cannibal tribe because he wanted to see them. The sick guy drew pictures of it and she as it was happening. Of course, for years the family tried to bury the fact and the stories and such. Discredit the witnesses. But the crazy bastard was happy to document the whole thing. His only rebuttal, in case it reflected badly on him, was that he wanted to see if they would do it, and his accounts matched up with the evidence witnesses had provided. The Armenian genocide wasn't even that long ago either, and Turkey still denies its existence. Battle of the Somme, one of the deadliest battles in history, and we don't talk about it much because it was in WW1. William Ellison Jr. He was one of the few black slave owners in the American South. You read that very much correctly. The Vipeholm experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless. Let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. For science. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for daily Reddit videos.